almost everybody in this country and throughout the West, not everybody, but almost everybody, whatever our politics, agrees that the threat of fascism is real. And there, the agreement ends. We can't agree on quite what fascism is. Rival political tribes accuse each other of being fascist. Many on the left see Trump as the embodiment of the fascist threat. Many on the right see the left as the true danger. And we point to history to justify our claims. The totalitarian regimes of right and left that caused such misery in the 20th century. Hitler, Stalin, Mao. But as we look further back, a disturbing pattern emerges. Nobody looks back at the collapse of the medieval Italian city-states, or the collapse of the Roman Republic, or the ancient Greek city-states. No one looks back at that and says, oh, well, gee, shucks, the good guys lost and the bad guys won. We have enough perspective to observe the polarization, the factionalism, the out-of-control warlords and mercenaries that eventually just ripped these societies apart. From this distance, we see it kind of like a chemical reaction. Monarchy to democracy to military dictatorship, rinse and repeat. Someone once asked Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State under Clinton. A reporter asked, "Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist?" And she answered, "I'm an optimist who worries a lot." And I want to argue today that that we need a wrenching but necessary synthesis in pursuit of a shared culture to keep the forces of polarization from blowing the American Republic apart. Now, in the same way that the vast majority of us agree that fascism is a bad thing, the vast majority of us think that democracy is a good thing. And again, here the agreement ends. We can't quite agree on what democracy is. And today, in this country and across the West, many people on the right and on the left reject what they see as a liberal order. Now, we can't quite decide whether liberalism is good or bad, and depending on that perspective, we're going to define it in the way that we would like to. And to break the gridlock, to get hopefully a more productive debate happening, let's forget for the moment how we're going to define these terms. And instead ask, what is clearly not liberal? Let's sketch an outline of what a pre-liberal point of view looks like, and also what a post-liberal point of view looks like. So first, the pre-liberal. About 700 years ago, there lived in the Islamic world a political philosopher named Ibn Khaldun. He's beloved by academics on the left these days. People call him a proto-sociologist. He's got a lot to offer us. He lived and died in North Africa and the Middle East at a time of military anarchy and general chaos. This was the time of the Black Death, of course, not just in Europe, but everywhere. Both of his parents died of the plague. And he observed the constant political flux, the constant political transformations. Desert tribes coming out of the desert to ravage cities, eventually to rule these cities. And amidst all of this, he came to formulate a theory of how and why societies rise and fall. In his experience, in his observation, no ruling dynasty, no government ever lasted longer than 3 generations. It just didn't happen in his world. He observed the pure and virtuous beginnings of these desert tribes who conquered cities, sweeping away decadent and corrupt rulers. And these conquerors soon fell themselves to corruption and decadence. And the forces of their own destruction began to mount. The pure lineages of the desert again knocked out the old rulers to begin the cycle anew. Ibn Khaldun's key explanation for how and why this happened was asabiya, he called it. Asabiya, this Arabic term that we usually translate as something like solidarity, group feeling. It connotes in the Arabic something bound and twisted. The fibers or the sinews that hold a group of people together. And in this evolution from primitive to civilized, Ibn Khaldun really lionized the moral character and the toughness of these desert tribes. Their asabiya is powerful. And he condemns the leisure and the sensual pleasure which corrupts the city dwellers and the rulers in particular. Their asabiya weakens and disappears. And this key term, asabiya, is eerily similar to the way that fascists, and I mean real avowed fascists of the early 20th century, the way that they saw their world and what was wrong with it. The term fascism comes from the Italian word fascio, which is a bound bundle of sticks. One stick is easily broken. That bound bundle of sticks cannot be broken. And by their own lights, fascists thought that they were saving Western civilization. We don't need to agree, but we do need to understand that this is what their perspective was. A decadent individualism, a corrupt international capitalism, a smug cosmopolitan elite was sucking the little guy dry. This should all be sounding very similar to us. These were their arguments. Now, of course, you do not need to call yourself a fascism to oppose liberalism. You could be an anarchist or a communist. You could be one of the so-called post-liberal conservative Catholic thinkers who were broadly opposed to the national and global order and specifically hostile to the US Constitution. We're more familiar with criticism of the US Constitution coming from the left, including some left liberals are opposed to the Constitution. But some post-liberal conservative thinkers also do this. Patrick Deneen, who is a political philosopher at Notre Dame University, characterizes America's founders as progressive liberals. Now, this will sound very odd to anyone not in that media bubble. His fellow critics of liberalism on the left would characterize the founders in the exact opposite way, as Neanderthal slave owners, right? Deneen calls for a simpler, more communal, more local life with small-scale communities, aligning precisely with the anarchists who yearn for the exact same thing. Perhaps the leader of the so-called post-liberal movement today is Adrian Vermeule, who is a professor at Harvard Law School. He has called for what he calls a common good constitutionalism, which aims to promote good government as the main priority. This is so far sounding kind of innocuous. But his argument is, if that trumps individual liberties, so be it. He's angered many on the right who, he supports, for example, in the lockdown, the COVID-19 lockdown, he came out in strong support of vaccine mandates on the rationale that the common good demands it. So he would find some alignment with the left, the left would find him absolutely antithetical. His stated plan is for non-liberal actors, he calls them, to infiltrate the state and gain positions of power. And he dismisses the fascist threat as merely the product of the fervid liberal imagination. A conservative critic of Vermeule wondered if there was perhaps something authoritarian infesting the water at Harvard Law School. But this school also has its defenders of liberalism too. This week in the New York Times, Cass Sunstein, another professor at Harvard Law School, laid out several key characteristics of liberalism: its embrace of plurality, its aversion to identity politics, its commitment to free speech. Yes, yes, and yes. But Sunstein neglects the strongest arguments of the critics of liberalism, saying, oh no, the critics of liberalism don't really understand what liberalism truly is. They're only caricaturing it. But who gets to decide what liberalism truly is versus what the caricature is? I mean, I love a good intellectual boxing match as much as the next person, perhaps more, but that wouldn't really be productive here. We would just not agree on definitions and go back and forth. A better approach would be more like Aikido. Aikido, a Japanese martial art that I used to train in. One of the main principles in Aikido is blending. You blend with your opponent, you blend with your attacker, and harness that person's momentum against them. In this case, we blend by acknowledging some of the main truths in the arguments against liberalism. I'll mention only two. First, that liberals often claim to be in possession of the objective truth, and thereby are usually hostile to conservative forms of religion. And second, that we tend to prioritize individual rights over everything else. Liberalism's critics call this dangerously naive. I'm a liberal who agrees with them. And this blending can never be just a mental exercise. Leave politics aside just for a moment. Think of the most intense arguments we've ever had in our personal lives. Arguments that might break up a marriage, that might send an adolescent storming out of the house, that cause us never to speak to our sister again. We're deep in a conflict. We're honestly trying to understand the other person. We're feeling like our words are being twisted. And across this gulf of incomprehension, it's difficult to impossible to give my experience of my sister's point of view back to her in a way that she recognizes as legitimate and fair, in a way that allows her to take a deep breath of relief and say, yes, that's what I'm saying. That's what I mean. You don't agree with me, but at least you get it. Working at this requires the sweat and the anguish of emotional intelligence. All the things we know, all the things that we think we know, tend to become obstacles here, conspire against our attempts to become emotionally literate. And we must bring this emotional literacy, emotional intelligence to our politics. Back in the 14th century, Ibn Khaldun argued that of all people who could be ruling, of all people, intellectuals, scholars, were the least suited to rule. Remember, he thought that the people of the desert were more courageous, more virtuous than the city folks were. Intellectuals are too abstract, he said, trying to impose their thoughts on the world, focusing more on what ought to be rather than on what is. An ordinary person, he says, does it very differently, judging the case on its own merits in a more grounded and embodied way. Now, Ibn Khaldun was, of course, an intellectual himself, but he shows a respect here for the common people, for common sense, that too many intellectuals then and now do not and did not. It's easy to condemn our inveterate racist uncle and say, he needs to get out more and meet people who don't look and think like him. And it's true. But it's even more true when we're the educated ones, when we're the ones who claim to know better. If we come from the working class or from farming folk, we have an advantage here. But too many scholars, intellectuals are detached from this reality. I was a graduate student at Stanford in 2016 when Trump won, and I heard my colleagues say things like this. Well, I've got 3,000 Facebook friends, and not one of them voted for Trump. Like, how and why? How possibly? This does not compute, People were fired up to go work in rural schools, with better education and, losing their pesky idiot religion, then people will realize their true interest. And then people won't, they'll realize what a danger Trump is. Perhaps. But also, perhaps, the zeal of secular missionaries is a contributing factor to the very problem itself, not really part of the solution. The point is not to beat up on intellectuals and dismiss expertise, as Trump and many others have done very effectively. Quite the contrary, acknowledging the weaknesses, acknowledging conducting a vigorous house cleaning is in our interest. It will help us in the guerrilla war currently underway. Guerrilla, little war in Spanish. At Lexington and Concord in the first battles of the American War for Independence, Americans used guerrilla tactics against the British to great effect. Not two armies lined up, but a series of ambushes against a superior force. Hit and fade operations, sniping, blending into the civilian population. In Vietnam, American forces were picked apart in the exact same way. These tactics work. And the abiding principle for anyone attempting to quell a guerrilla insurgency is that we must distinguish between the fighters and the populace. Our biggest enemy is our own overreactions. And our inability to draw this line, even roughly accurately, is really the thing that will sink us more than anything the enemy can possibly do. Think of the massacres of civilians in Vietnam, the ways in which we were our own worst enemy, radicalizing normal people who became increasingly outraged, increasingly likely to support the fighters and to become fighters themselves. Now, this is analogy, but this is also reality today. As citizens committed to working within the system, flawed as it is, how do we respond to those who say they want to take a wrecking ball to the system? How do we confront those who pose a threat to our way of life? How do we distinguish between those who pose a threat to our way of life and those who do not? A good starting point would be to go back to that principle of emotional intelligence and to acknowledge at the outset that our overreactions are and will continue to be our own worst enemy. And then let's work to distinguish the fighters from the populace. The many people on right and left who are fed up with what they see as a bankrupt and irredeemable status quo, not the enemy. Those who have hoisted the black flag, preaching violence to overthrow the system, enemy. Trump voters, not the enemy. Those who conspired to kidnap the governor of Michigan a few years back, enemy. Protesters on January 6th who did not commit acts of violence or vandalism, not the enemy. Those who committed or conspired to commit acts of violence on January the 6th, enemy. Devilishly hard sometimes to tell apart, but we've got to try. As we send our winged monkeys against the guerrillas, against the actual fighters, We must also work hard to peel normal people away from these fighters and from the election fraud fairy tales and much else. We can do this with carrots and with sticks, with empathy and with persuasion, with humility and with conviction. This requires us to interact closely with people whose views we may despise. Not as a weird add-on or box-checking exercise, right? Not as missionaries, but in the rhythms of our daily lives. People who are outraged. People who adhere to kinds of religion that are repellent to us. People who take refuge in wacky conspiracy theories. People who reject what they see as liberalism. These people are our brothers and sisters. We can empathize with those who think that the system is broken, beyond repair, even as we insist on our capacity to rise to the challenge and defend the U.S. Constitution as a bulwark of our way of life. Now, Trump doesn't know enough about the Constitution to care about it. And likewise, large swaths of the left explicitly oppose the Constitution. But though far from perfect, our Constitution is robust and adaptable. It has changed over time. Despite our youth as a country, our Constitution is the oldest written constitution on the globe today, still active. It steers us clear from the cycle of monarchy to democracy, back to dictatorship that has so plagued other parts of the world. And the makers and the defenders of the U.S. Constitution are the adults in the room of liberalism. Madeleine Albright died last year. But in her 2018 book on fascism, she laid out 3 nightmare scenarios. In the first, reactionary billionaires monopolize media platforms. A right-wing echo chamber comes to dominate an anti-immigrant, socially conservative regime repressing free speech. In the second, wealthy coastal elites repeal the Second Amendment and impose a left-wing echo chamber in which anyone who defies their socially progressive standards is labeled a bigot, a racist, a Nazi. She calls this the fascist liberal scenario. Third nightmare scenario. A series of terrorist attacks hits, a US-based Muslim group claims responsibility, a shaken president begs Americans to trust the government, but paramilitary groups begin targeting not just immigrants, not just Muslims, but also targeting groups protesting against racial profiling, a charismatic young orator and his blood and soil rhetoric gain traction. Those are her 3 nightmare scenarios. And she wrote this book, of course, in response to Trump's election, his takeover of the Republican Party. But she cautions as well that Democrats appear unaware that the same thing could happen to them. She calls for a renewal of the vital center, building our emotional capacity for a shared civic life, a shared culture, is really the work of our generation. If we neglect this crucial work, if we lump in the proverbial suburban soccer mom who is pro-life and who voted for Trump, if we lump her in to those who actually conspired to kidnap the governor of Michigan, those who actually committed violence or conspired to commit violence on January 6th in order to overturn violently the election results of 2020. If we fail to distinguish between these two, this is not just bad analysis on our part. We're basically severing our political sinews, our asabia. This is political suicide on our part. If the United States of America falls to fascism, it will not be because the good guys lost. It will be because we drew too clumsy a line between good and bad, making potential brothers and sisters into enemies. It will be because we denied the genius of the Constitution, because we ignored the necessity of a shared culture. Now, not many people in history have been able to say, "Our fate is in our hands." For all his wisdom, Ibn Khaldun couldn't. But if we can muster the intestinal fortitude, then the future really is ours.